Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Hayley Cox and I'm brand manager for Prosure360. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to our quarterly webinar hosted in partnership with IMSM. We have a lot of valuable information to get through, so we're going to start right away. But before I hand you over to our industry experts, I just want to let you know a couple of things. If you have any questions as we go along, please pop them in the chat box. And additionally, you should see 3 PDF downloads in the handout section, which you're welcome to download. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Prosure360 and IMSM. Prosure360 began in 2021. It's a unique SSIP platform that we built in-house from the ground up, helping our clients build resilient and sustainable supply chains. IMSM are leading ISO specialists who deliver high quality ISO consultancy services worldwide. Together, I think we're just a little bit behind there. Thanks, Scott. Together, we are helping businesses ensure quality and demonstrable compliance. So without further delay, I'm going to hand you over to Scott and to James.
Thank you, Hayley. Before we kick off, just a couple of quick introductions. Firstly, my name's Scott. I'm the operations director over at Prosure360, and been with the business for about 2 years now. And pre that, I've had 14 years worth of experience working within supply chain. So I've had the joy, I suppose, of being able to see this topic that we're going to talk about here today, ESG, and how we can master it as businesses, from both sides, from an end user that's been asked to demonstrate, as well as the side that we're in at the moment, or I'm experiencing at the moment, in helping businesses demonstrate their ESG credentials.
Good stuff. Thank you, Scott. My name's James. I'm a commercial manager with IMSM based here in the UK. I've been working with the standards for a decade now, and one thing has always remained: they're a great tool for helping usually SMEs, but any size of organisation, to look at their ESG criteria. So delighted to partner up with Prosure today and see if we can unpick these two really important subjects and give some practical advice along the way. So we were planning this webinar because you can log in most times of the week and you'll get an advert for a webinar talking about ESG and giving a good overview of it. But Scott and I were really keen to make this a practical exercise where possible and give some tangible answers and some tangible examples of what you as a business can do, both within the company and actually within your supply chain. So the aims are really simple. It's providing those simple, actionable steps to working towards ESG compliance. And one of the ways we think we can do that is with ISO. So it's that comprehensive overview, a bit of an introduction to the subject as well, but most people are familiar with it now. But it's also really narrowing in on what the emphasis is on a supply chain perspective, because it's far too easy to look purely at your own business. But a lot of what Scott's going to talk us through is actually how do you recognise ESG in your supply chain. So I think on that basis, Scott, it's over to you.
Yep, thank you, James. So yeah, as James just mentioned there, we've got a variety of people on the call. We've seen through the registration questions that some people have more of an understanding of the wider ESG subject, others less so. So just to bring everyone up to speed, I'm just going to start by going back to basics really, and having a look initially at what ESG is in the first instance. And it's the collective term that's used to describe how a business impacts on the people and the world around them ultimately. It involves and talks about or looks at the effectiveness and the transparency of their policies and procedures and how they implement these within their day-to-day operations. One thing I think people fail to recognize is that this is a subject that's relevant to every organization, no matter their size. From 1 employee up to 10,000, businesses all interact with their local community and their wider environment in different ways. So ESG is really a topic that is relevant to everybody. It's commonly broken down into its three main pillars. It's a very vast subject, but today we're going to have a look at the core fundamentals of it, which are the environmental aspects, the social aspects, and the governance aspects. And each represents a set of criteria that both investors and stakeholders, as well as members of the public, use to evaluate a company's impact and performance in each of the key areas. If we start off initially by having a look at the environmental aspect, as you would expect, this focuses on the company's or the business's impact on the wider environment. And it includes considerations such as carbon emissions, energy efficiency, waste management, and the overall ecological sustainability of that organization. The second factor is the social aspect, and this assesses how a company manages its relationships with its employees, its suppliers, its customers, and the wider community in which it operates. And the topics that fall under the social category generally include things such as diversity and inclusion, labour practices, human rights, and community engagement. And the final aspect is governance. And this refers to how a company's internal policies, its leadership structures, its overall corporate governance, and it generally includes aspects such as board composition, executive compensation, shareholder rights, and business and ethical practices. I think what's key to remember here is that ESG impacts generally extend beyond your own internal processes and practices. As James said, we're going to talk a little bit about supply chain here. And generally, that's because the largest ESG impact of a business comes from the supply chain. But when I'm talking about supply chain throughout, I'm not just talking about the things that come first to mind, such as our freight forwarders, our hauliers, our shipping lines, where we're dealing with physically moving products, because this topic covers both well, it includes businesses that sell services as well as products alone. So what many do fail to recognize is that a supply chain of a business is constructed up of many partners or suppliers, every partner and supplier, to be fair, that enables you to keep your business operational and providing goods and services through to your customers. So if you were to take a moment right now, just have a think of every service provider that you use within your business, FM contractor, professional service, consultant, supplier, vendor, or even work contractor that enables you to keep the lights on, your business safe and operational. You'll gain quite quickly an understanding of just how vast your supply chain really is. So that's a little bit of an intro into ESG, but you're not here just to find out about that. You want to understand how we can master this. But before I jump into that, I just want to explain why ESG is important and a topic that we should all be focusing on. It's safe to say that the significance of ESG in the modern business landscape has gained and is continuing to gain more and more traction and importance as the years go on. And in turn, this is forcing both businesses, large and small, into taking action and forcing them into being able to understand and demonstrate their own ESG credentials. These credentials are important to be aware of because they're increasingly shaping how consumers and investors view our business. And it's again important just to recognize this affects both B2B as well as B2C businesses, because your consumers generally are gaining more and more of awareness about this. So I've got 8 points here just to quickly whiz through. The first one, consumers, as we all know, are becoming more conscious of global issues such as climate change, social inequality, and corporate ethics. And as a result, they're beginning to seek products and services from companies that align with their own values and ethical standards. Because of this, there's generally an increased demand for transparency as consumers are seeking to understand the environmental and the social impacts of the products and the services that they're using. Generally, companies with strong ESG practices often have a better brand image and enjoy higher levels of consumer trust. And what can be seen is the positive promotion of this ethical behavior can lead to increased customer loyalty, generally as consumers prefer to support businesses that share their own values, especially when experiencing their own ESG pressures.
We're seeing a growing trend as well in a lot of the businesses we deal with, Scott, that actually recruitment. So yes, you're selling to customers, but you're actually selling to potential employees. And more applicants, job seekers, I think, are looking at organisations' ESG credentials. It's a candidate market. It's not an employer market. And the candidates, I think, are demanding to see those credentials and scope out who they want to work for based on it, really.
I happen to agree. It's definitely people are becoming more value driven, and they're more conscious of the companies they work with and are more likely to shop around to find that business that they are happy to invest, I suppose, their time into working for. So completely agree with that, James. Up next, we've got investors, and that's because they're generally there's generally an increase of demand for understanding of ESG criteria when people are looking at what their investment decision should be. And these ESG factors are generally used to assess how a company will perform long term, because it helps identify what their sustainability levels will be and their potential risks. And there's also an increase in ESG focused funds, where investors are backing businesses or backing industries that are really pioneering in ESG. We also see that some governments are mandating ESG reporting for companies, making ESG more of a regulatory requirement. We see this specifically in the UK for generally larger businesses and financial institutions who have to disclose their information to the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures. And also within the European Union, there's also the ESG regulatory framework as another example of where this is becoming a regulatory requirement. A growing aspect is activist investors who are generally using their voting power to demand ESG related changes within companies, using that to put pressure on boards and management to take action. Similar to what James has just said there about the impact this has on the recruitment piece, the next 2 points do touch upon that. So ESG conscious companies tend to be better at identifying and mitigating long-term risks. And companies focusing on ESG generally are more pioneering and adaptive to market conditions, making them more attractive to investors and employees, which ties in quite nicely to companies with strong ESG credentials, often finding it easier to attract and retain top talent. And up last, consumer expectations. So consumers expect companies to ensure responsible and sustainable practices throughout their entire supply chains. There's generally an increase in pressure for companies then to disclose that information about the suppliers' ESG practices from the consumers that they operate with. And for these businesses, reputational damage can occur for supply chain partners from something as small as association. So identifying where your ESG risks are and mitigating that risk early is key. So in summary, there's 2 main tranches that all of these points fall into, and that is consumer pressure and investor pressure. And ESG ESG considerations have become a fundamental part of consumer and investor decision making. Consumers that prioritize ESG factors not only contribute to a sustainable future, but also tends to benefit from increased customer support, investor interest, and ultimately long-term value creation as well. So ESGs become more of a strategic imperative for businesses rather than a nice to have, especially if they're looking to thrive within an evolving marketplace.
Absolutely, and I think the way a colleague of mine summarises it slightly cheekily, but I would put it to everybody listening to this webinar, is show me a business that wants to be unsustainable, or show me a business that doesn't want to have a social value, or they don't want to have good governance. It simply doesn't exist. So it's trying to use that as the starting place and then realise, okay, there's a wider business benefit to doing this, and actually it's not going to kill us to do it. So it's really interesting, I think, month on month, and that's how minor it can get, but how month on month, how businesses choose to change the way that they look at ESG and adopt it. And we see that really frequently in the context of ISO. A lot of people still see ISO certification as a box ticking exercise, but there's actually some really broad business benefits to doing it. And they near enough match up with the benefits that you've just gone through on there, Scott. And interestingly, you cannot really become ESG certified, but you can become an ISO certified. So the route to actually proving, proof in the pudding as to why it's worth doing it is slightly difficult. And we're being quite ambitious to say to businesses, actually look at ISO as a way of choosing ESG. And we think we're on the right track with that. So we're going to shift this slightly back to the audience. I think we're really keen, and our sign up suggested we had a really diverse range of businesses logging into this today, but we actually want to sort of put the spotlight on you, and that's just to understand, as a business, how much work have you done towards ESG compliance, or looking at it, and try not to think too specifically about particular documents you've created or whatever, but if you were to be asked as a gut feeling, where are you with your ESG compliance? So it will take a few seconds for you just to see that on your screens and respond. Now, I don't know about you, Scott, while people are answering this, I find the easiest way to get an answer to this question is not usually with a member of the management team, but it's actually on the shop floor, and it's asking members of the team at a particular organisation what they're doing.
I agree. I think it's easy as a member of the management team to assume that these things are in place, but you don't really know if it's truly embedded until you get to the, as you say, that person on the shop floor who can either demonstrate to you that they're aware of it, or at least aware of what the business is doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So I believe, I'm not sure if we're going to be going through these poll answers today, but we may have time towards the end. If not, we will definitely be putting some nice infographics with some comments on our LinkedIn pages. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for those, because they'll be coming out in the next few days. So what we're going to take a look at next is how a business can ultimately effectively design and implement an ESG strategy, because that's what we're here to work out today. And we're going to work through this in a 5-step process. So we've created 5 practical steps here, which will provide a simple structure to the implementation process. And this structure will apply to both businesses large and small. It's in effect the same no matter what end of the scale that you're on. So if we dive in first of all to the first step of the practical guides, that is assessment and benchmarking. And as with everything, as with every project that any business is going to embark on, we need to find out what our starting point is. So In its most basic form, this will involve a review of your current practices to understand where you currently stand concerning the ESG factors that you're interested in understanding. And the easiest way to go through this is by following 3 steps, really. Conducting an audit to assess your current company's environmental impact, the social practices, and the governance structures will involve evaluating things such as your energy consumption, waste management, labour practices, and ethical governance. And this is the stage that Prosure360 generally gets involved with our clients' ESG journey. When they come to us to benefit from our expertise and our understanding and how we can best gather this ESG information from the supply chain, which, as I said earlier, generally forms the largest proportion of the ESG impact of that business. It's then important to compare your findings against industry standards and competitors. This benchmarking process helps identify where your business excels, as well as identifying areas where you need some improvement. And I would be sure to utilize industry-specific benchmarks, as these are beneficial to gain a comprehensive understanding of the industry and your business as well. You should definitely prioritize your ESG focus based on the materiality to your business and industry. As I said, the ESG subject is incredibly vast, and by doing this, it will help ensure that your approach is not only focused, but you're directing your attention to the most significant factors that will impact both you as a business and your stakeholders as well. And I would say the most important aspect of the assessment and benchmarking process here is to be honest with your findings. As with any fact-finding process, the more honest you are with your results and your findings, the more relevant your goal settings and prioritizations will be, and the better the result that will come out the back of it.
This is it. And for businesses looking to go through an ISO project, implementing an ISO, we start in exactly the same place. And actually, we think for businesses that have got a resolve to look at their ESG performance, conducting a gap analysis to an ISO standard can be a huge help to uncovering where you are at with your ESG. If we take ISO 14001, for example, which is an environmental management standard, you're looking through such a wide range of your business. It's not just the key things you would think of, it's most tenets of the business. And it would look at everything from policy setting to objectives, suppliers, stakeholders, monitoring and measuring, all the rest of it. So starting with that gap analysis for ISO is really important. But if you don't want to go down such a formal route as an ISO, some really quick benchmarking you can do as a business is things like your carbon emissions. And for listeners in the UK, DEFRA have got a really good tool on their website for helping you map and plot your carbon footprint, but also things like your diversity makeup of the organisation, your board. There'll be benchmarks available often in your particular industries, and also for governance, looking at things like competition to see what governance instruments they use. They may have ISO certification, they may have investors and people, all these kind of things. So benchmarking is no longer an exercise that you have to bring an expensive consultant in to carry out. It's something you can do quite easily with the comfort of your own computer.
As I would also add to that as well, as ESG is becoming more of a sales piece as well, a lot of businesses out there will be shouting about it through their social media, through their websites as well. So if you're going to even be conducting some competitor analysis, there would also be some good places to start, be able to find plenty of information through companies' websites. Thank you, James. So if we move on to step 2, which is stakeholder engagement. This step is simply about building relationships with the key stakeholders that you hold within your business and understanding their expectations regarding the ESG issues. It's most commonly achieved through first identifying who the key stakeholders are that you want to help shape your ESG strategy as a business. This can include your customers, it can include your investors. In my opinion, should always include your employees. It should include your suppliers and the communities in which you operate as well. The use of surveys, feedback sessions, interviews are all simple ways of gathering the insights that you want to pull from these stakeholders. But what is key is to tailor the data collection so that you can best understand their expectations, their concerns, and their priorities regarding your ESG practices. The third and final step of this piece is to develop a communication strategy based on the feedback that you've received from these stakeholders. This strategy should outline how you as a business plan to address the stakeholder expectations and how you are going to integrate those ESG principles into your wider operation as well.
This is it, and again, anyone familiar with an ISO standard or those that are holding it, one of the first things we do after a gap analysis is look at your interested parties, and this is ISO speak for stakeholders, and it's the typical assortment you would expect. So it's your staff, it's your customers, financial backers, members of the board, and then the wider society and population around you. But it's really important, and yes, they're fairly easy to identify who they are. The next step in that is actually documenting and coming up with strategies for how you deal with them and how you communicate with those stakeholders. It's really important, and any businesses looking to improve their ESG posture should be thinking about particular interested parties and how they take them on that journey. So that can be as broad as things like focus groups, where you actually involve customers in some of your policy setting, or it could be employee focus groups and that sort of thing. It's really important to take people on that journey with you as an interested party.
Thank you, James. The slide's not moving forward. Let's try that. Okay, so this moves us on to the third step of the process, which is policy development and integration. So by following the first couple of steps, you should now have a relatively clear understanding as to your current standing as a business and the stakeholder expectations. So with this information, it's now time to start to develop and integrate what your ESG policies are going to look like and how you're going to integrate those into your wider business strategy. So to successfully navigate this, firstly, you need to clearly decide and define your ESG objectives. Whether this is reducing your carbon emissions, promoting diversity and inclusion within your business, or enhancing governance structures, it's really key to create specific and measurable goals. Involving key stakeholders in the policy development process, again, is imperative. Your stakeholders have taken the time to feedback what is important to them. So ensuring that when you're developing these policies, that you receive their feedback just to sense check that what you're going to put in place is aligning with their expectations. And what this will in turn result in is them being more likely to be embraced as a policy and accepted moving forward as well. The third point is how you integrate your ESG policies seamlessly into your overall business strategy. This piece here cannot be overlooked. It really is imperative to consider how these ESG objectives will align with your wider business mission, your wider vision, and your long-term goals. The integration itself needs to ensure that ESG becomes a fundamental part of everything you are doing as an organization, not a bolt-on. If it's a bolt-on, it will likely get left behind. Every decision, every vision does need to include, or take into account your wider ESG mission?
I think that's spot on. And one of the biggest things with the policies that you develop is that it's not an internal document that stays on a SharePoint site or on a notice board. You will be asked for it more. We as an organisation require from the vast majority of our suppliers copies of their ESG policies or their environmental policies. And it's becoming increasingly rare, I think, for an organisation not to have those. And it's a really simple policy to develop. And I think for any small businesses that are on the call or small businesses looking to really crack this ESG subject, having a think over a cup of coffee as to what you want your business to look like in regards to ESG is the first step to writing that policy. It's understanding who you are as a business, who you serve, and recognising the impact that you do have. And more businesses are of a reduced or less of an impact than older, more established businesses, but you should still consider it. And I can almost guarantee, the trend is going to go up for businesses asking for these policies. Scott will see this in supply chain management. Those policies need to be readily available, and they need to be able to see that they're in place.
Agreed. The data collection piece, whether you're doing it internally or whether you're widening that to your entire supply chain, takes a substantial amount of time. Gathering the most appropriate information, just getting the engagement from the key stakeholders, it can be a challenge. So it's not something you should wait to be asked for. We'll touch upon a couple of points moving forward, but this is, I've already said it, it's becoming more of a business imperative rather than a nice to have, because people are expecting to see this information.
I think that leads us into our
leads us on.
You go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that leads us on, James, back to the next poll question.
Yeah, which is an extension of that, and it's a good time for you to think, as a listener, how much awareness do you currently have of your supply chain? So that's not standard things. How many businesses are in that supply chain, and what do they do? Have a slightly more detailed think about their ESG credentials, but their impact as well. And do you know of any of your key suppliers that are taking concrete steps in this area? So you should see that question pop up. How much awareness do you have of your supply chain and its ESG efforts / credentials? It's a really good question, and we're looking forward to seeing the data on this, Scott, I think. And while people are answering this, Scott, I assume from your perspective with Prosure360 and the platform you have, this is actually one of the key tenets of it, is having that visibility, and specifically on things like ESG compliance.
Yeah, putting uniformity, I would say, in terms of the questions that are going out, and just having a platform by which you can gather this information and refer back to it, I think is quite important. It can obviously be done through traditional means such as spreadsheets and things like that. However, yeah, there's quite a lot of setup required in terms of understanding what sort of questions you're looking to glean the answers for, as well as just getting the involvement from, as I said, those stakeholders, specifically the ones in your supply chain that potentially don't see this as an important factor to them. So thank you all for your time answering that. And the reason we put that in is because it does lead us quite nicely into our next point here, and that is the employee and the supply chain training and engagement aspect. So as the policies have been developed and should be in place, you've got a good understanding of what they're going to look like. It's then crucial that we involve the stakeholders that are going to be involved with the delivering of the strategy to make sure that they're all aligned and actively contributing to the ESG initiatives that you've set as a business. The only way this can be effectively done is through employees and supply chain training and engagement. So firstly, at this stage, we need to consider developing training programs. We need to look at this both from an internal and an external perspective. So for your own employees, getting them to understand the ESG strategy, getting them to understand how they can impact on that is really important. That's probably the simplest part of it. The harder part of that is how do you get that same level of engagement throughout your supply chain businesses? You need to make sure that they're fully committed to it, and you need to ensure that they have the awareness as to what it is that you're trying to achieve. But ultimately, you will have to likely support these businesses through capacity building programs so that they gain more of an understanding of how their business can adapt and change to ultimately impact on your own ESG standards. If your supply chain falls short of this, with them being such a large proportion of your ESG impact, ultimately you're likely to fall short of your own goals moving forward. I think what's important as well, before I actually move on to the next step here, is remembering that the world of ESG is forever changing. It's still a relatively new concept, and the awareness and the understanding of what ESG is and how your business can adapt and improve the ESG impact is similar to where a lot of businesses was with health and safety if we go back 15, 20 years ago. And I think because of that, the education piece, especially as I said, to those smaller organizations within your supply chain, will be really key. It will be, it'll be imperative. But now that I've touched on that, and I've brought up the next point, I think what's important next is that we encourage participation, and you should really aim to foster a culture of responsibility and sustainability within your organization. As I said, that is the easiest aspect of the process for you. But this helps with having your stakeholders engaged, using things, getting them involved in participating with the ESG initiatives, sharing ideas, actively contributing to the company's environmental and social goals will ultimately help embed the ESG strategy into the wider company culture. And it's once it's embedded within the culture, that's when it really begins to generate traction. That's when it becomes part of everyone's day-to-day, and it doesn't sit as a side piece to what people believe your main goals are as an organization. And we should work, if all that work is going into the process, we need to work hard to recognize and reward the stakeholders that are actively contributing and achieving the ESG goals of the business. This supports in maintaining awareness and the focus towards the goals, but also helps create a sense of shared responsibility and pride amongst all those that are involved. And that moves us on to step 5 of the process, which is continuous monitoring and improvement. So implementing a successful ESG strategy within a business is an ongoing process. It requires constant evaluation, it requires constant refinement. So by putting in place robust monitoring systems to track the key ESG metrics through regular data collection, analysis, reporting, will all help in identifying if you're moving closer or in fact you're moving further away from achieving your ESG goals. This needs to be further supported through conducting regular review meetings. It's through these that you'll be able to assess the effectiveness of your ESG policies with your key stakeholders. And these meetings will often provide an opportunity to discuss the challenges, the successes, as well as areas of improvement that the data that you achieve or you receive through your monitoring systems may not show. The other factor that you gain to benefit from having these meetings is it helps you keep your goals and your priorities dynamic. It allows you to remain aligned with industry standards, regulatory changes, as well as just identifying what needs to be tweaked slightly in order to gain an even greater improvement in a specific area. And up last, we have a step that personally I feel can be easily forgotten by businesses, but is probably the most important and imperative for success in the process. And that is establishing positive, active feedback loops with all your key stakeholders. It's, to me, fundamental that you regularly seek the input on your ESG performance. You as a business might think you're doing incredibly well, but there could be a specific stakeholder group that feels things could be done in a slightly different way or an improved way. So you can use this feedback to continually improve your initiatives. And this proactive approach as well allows you to demonstrate your commitment and your transparency and responsiveness, which ultimately will continue to help support the engagement from all those that are involved with the process.
I think this is one of the most natural fits for actually where an ISO can play such a huge role in ESG compliance. Continual improvement sits completely at the heart of an ISO, and it's all about that continuous improvement loop, that plan, do, check, act cycle. And this is where we see the most exciting developments, usually with small businesses on their ESG journey. They start with what may look like a fairly modest goal, on their first attempt, but actually as they continually review and develop that, it grows into something really, really good. And even us as an organisation, I've been with IMSM for 10 years, coming up to 11, and we've grown every single year when it comes to our ESG compliance. And there were some good initiatives. When I started, I'm looking out our window into the garden. We've got a B box that was issued to all staff and key clients about 8 years ago. It's still there. And recently we've renewed our tree planting initiative to help offset some of our carbon footprint, but actually to allow businesses to do the same and shout about theirs. So it is a continual effort. There's no perfect from the outset, but it does come back to that whole thing as well about reviewing and monitoring. You meet what you measure, and the more times you can review it, the more likely you are to meet it. So we feel very, very passionately about the role this plays. And that takes us on to the next point, I think, Scott, actually, which is what's in it for you as an organisation. What is the reward on the table for ESG? And we can talk about the normal things, potentially more business, better recognition in the marketplace, but there's some really fundamental business points, business-friendly points for pushing ESG. And many of the questions we had in advance to this webinar were, from individuals that weren't particularly high up, perhaps in management chains, but were really keen to push ESG in their organisations, and they needed to sell it to their management teams. And we think some of those points we put up on the screen are the key things, but it's all about visibility and control. ESG gives you visibility and control over your impact, but actually the stakeholders around you, and that has a host of financial, operational and societal quick wins. And as more and more businesses now fall into slightly different regulatory groups, you see things like the Non-Financial Reporting Act here in the UK. More businesses need to be able to quickly evidence their ESG goals, and evidence has always been the key thing, Scott, isn't it? And one of the hardest things to grasp. I think we started this conversation 15 years ago with sustainability about moving from very broad statements through to goals, but it's actually about systems that sit underneath those goals, and that's such a business benefit for people to realise. what was your take on this, B, Scott? Because you're working with supply chain businesses all day, and you know they're always going to be keen to see what's in it for them for doing this.
Of course, I think a lot of the businesses we work with, they are definitely experiencing that external pressure, generally through investors. That's where the majority of it's coming from at the moment. A lot of them are within the B2B environment, so they have the less consumer pressure, but they're beginning to see just how important the whole ESG landscape is, and how vast it really is as well. I wasn't aware pre-coming to Prosure just how big the supply chain impact for a business would actually be, but I don't know why it took me so long to realize, but ultimately it's the bit that is so very important to gain a good understanding of early. There are great businesses out there that are doing great things as well, and by engaging with them, it can also help you as a business shape your understanding of what your goals and priorities should be when you're developing an ESG strategy, or even when you're going through that continuous improvement piece. Because I know there'll be a number of participants on the call here today that feel they've got strong ESG policies and procedures in place, but without those being continually reviewed, tweaked, you're never too sure how relevant they still are to, well, in an ever-evolving marketplace.
Yeah,
so absolutely. I think that leads us on to our final slide, which is our contact details, James. If anyone does need to reach out, or has any additional questions that haven't come through in the chat, feel free to reach out to either myself or James. Our details are there. Our websites are there if you want to find out a little bit more about what we can offer you as a business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think,
James,
I think one of the things we pride ourselves on, Scott, is that, you know, ESG, ISO certification, they're not the most accessible of subjects, but we really are there to help navigate that path for a business. That's why we've put our personal contact details there. We're not in this just to send you a load of marketing material. We're really happy to pick up the phone, jump on a Teams call, and actually chat through your priorities as a business and see how we can help. So please do get in touch. Are we on to questions, Scott? Because I know we've had a fair few in.
We had quite a few before. There's been a couple that's come through throughout. I know you've answered that the benchmarking question quite well, James. I don't know if that was planned, but you picked up on that pretty much as soon as it came in, so that's positive. But we did have a number of questions that came through at the registration stage, so happy to go through a couple of those at the moment. I selected a couple that I thought would sit quite nicely with the content that we've got, and potentially would be a bit more relevant to a wider audience. And you touched upon one earlier there, James, about this is slightly less of a question, more a statement, I feel, but one of the audience members had mentioned that they would need to convince their senior managers, and I can't really express how important this is. I'd say, as with every business initiative, getting the buy-in, the support, the continued support of leadership goes an insanely long way. When it comes to ESG embedding, as I mentioned earlier throughout my slides, I would say making sure that your policies are interwoven with everyday business practices is really fundamental to the ongoing success. And as your senior leadership team are generally the ones that are steering your business from the helm, they're deciding what direction you should be going, ensuring that they are bought in, that they are fully aware of the importance of the ESG strategies and policies that are already in place, as well as the goals that you may not have achieved yet. It's really important at making sure that they're not undermining those policies by changing strategy in a way that's disregarding what is important and ultimately going to make you successful with achieving your ESG goals. Anything to add to that, James?
No, I think it's really hard to give a broad brush answer to that. You know, in an SME environment, I think it's often the case of sort of rolling your sleeves up, getting on with it, and setting the example. And there's usually a host of rewards available for individuals that want to do that in the long term. But from an ESG perspective, I think setting an example is really important. So if you're not able to get through to your leadership within a business, I think it's recognizing, well, what can I do within my current role? So that might be forming working groups yourselves with colleagues, people like-minded individuals, or it might even be producing a report on your views and how you think the organisation should try and meet those views. It comes down to communication with all these things, and it's having that open channel with your leadership teams as to what you want to do and how you plan on doing it.
I've just seen a question come in, and that question is, how does ESG relate to CSR? And this is an interesting one, and one that I've actually been posed before. There's generally a belief that they're two separate things, but I see them actually being quite interlinked. One doesn't supersede the other, although I think CSR was coined a little bit before. Certainly in the business landscape has been used slightly longer than ESG, but CSR, corporate sustainable responsibility, as it suggests, it sits within, I would say, the social aspect of ESG. It forms quite a large part of that, so it sits very much hand in hand with ESG. So I would say CSR relates to ESG. You got a take on that, James?
I think when I started my career working in standards, CSR was the word du jour. Everyone was talking about CSR. There weren't many people referring to ESG. But I would agree with you that CSR, I think, points to the societal and the governance side of ESG, and potentially not that much on the environmental side. I think with CSR, we used to look at it through more of a charity lens, so how businesses would interact with charities and local causes. You don't always see that with ESG, so there's benefits to both there. I think I'd view ESG as more formal than CSR. ESG has got a lot more compliance and regulatory instruments attached to it, in my opinion, whereas CSR does seem like a very local initiative for an organisation to make, and not necessarily linked to their wider stakeholders. But I'd be very happy to be corrected on that. But that would be my personal take on it, Scott.
Cool, thank you. I think using that, I'll jump back to a question that we received in the sign up, and that was, how do we adapt our policies and processes to the 17 SDGs? It's acronym
after acronym, isn't it?
Over to you, James, if you want to jump in on this one.
Yeah, no, take a go. I mean, so SDGs, again, just to unpick the acronyms, are Sustainable Development Goals. And these were set by the United Nations some time ago. And they fit into broad themes. When it comes to ESG, and certainly our side of it with ISO certification and management systems, it'd be two or three that would jump out to me. One is I think they call it the responsible consumption SDG, and things like production. So that SDG 12, sorry, is responsible consumption, and that's fundamentally what resources you as a business use and how responsible is it. And that's really clear to see in a manufacturing lens, because it's going to be your raw materials and your energy. But it's always a lot harder with service-based organizations. And that is actually where things like Prosure and people like Scott come in, because it's looking at your supply chain. Even if you are a service organization, it's what products and services do you commission. So there's definitely an overlap there. And it really depends what type of organization you are, because you may look at climate action. So if you are a high energy user, there's an SDG for that, SDG 13, and that links again to affordable and clean energy. I think the key thing to do is have a look at those SDGs and see where you as an organization see the best fit, and then look at your impact in your existing policies. Definitely no broad brush answer to that.
Completely agree. 17, they are very varied as well. Not, I can't remember, I think it was, what was it, step 3, I believe, where you're making sure, step 2, sorry, where you're making sure that your policies are relevant to your industry, relevant to your business. I think when you're looking at all 17, you will quite quickly see that not all 17 are necessarily relevant to your business. I think what's important off the back of that as well is not trying to achieve all of them. Ultimately, we would love to, every business would love to achieve all 17 SDGs, but certainly if you're starting your ESG journey, picking the ones that are most relevant to you, picking the ones that you feel you could make the largest impact on, is an important place to start. If I think back to one of our larger clients in the property management sector, they utilize the 17 SDGs to develop and better understand what their ESG policy should be moving forward. And even a large organization such as them, I believe it was 11 that they ended up identifying as the most critical, and the ones that would provide the most impact and ultimate benefit back to them and their stakeholders. So I would say don't try and achieve all of them straight away. Ultimately, through step 5 of revising and the continuous improvement piece, yes, you can always add in additional pieces, but start with the ones that are most relevant to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary, Scott. Probably a good point to end on, I would think, the SDGs. That's a nice little quick action point to those on the call to go away and take a look at those, I'd say. Yeah,
definitely a good starting point. Even just to understand the wider scope of ESG, because there's a lot on there that wouldn't necessarily jump first to mind. So definitely a good starting point. And I am conscious of the time as well, James. We've almost used the full hour.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Scott, thank you very much, for the time and the opportunity to discuss this today. It's been a good session, I think.
It has. So I would like to thank everyone for their time today. I believe that there'll be a recording sent out off the back of this. As I've already said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either James or myself, and we'll do our best to provide you with the answer or point you in the right direction. We both have people within both Prosure360 and IMSM who are real subject matter experts on this, so we'll definitely be able to get the right information back to you. But once again, thank you, James, thank you, Hayley, for introducing us at the beginning, and thank you all for taking the time out today to listen to us.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.